December 20th, 1943. The sky over northern Germany was supposed to be clear in the forecasts, but by mid-morning, it was a layered mess of cloud, contrails, and smoke. At 20,000 feet, the world was reduced to four things: gray light, cold metal, the vibration of four big engines, and the distant thump of flak. Inside one particular B-17F, tail number 42-31167, the men simply called it what someone had painted on the nose in a curling hand: Ye Olde Pub. The first shell that truly mattered did not sound dramatic. It was a flat, hard concussion under the pilot's boots, followed by a slap of pressure that punched through the fuselage. The cockpit windows blew white with cracks, the nose filled with glittering dust, and every loose item in reach jumped. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a young man from West Virginia on his first combat mission, felt the control column kick in his hands and the fortress roll sluggishly to the right. "Number 2's hit," someone called over the interphone, voice too high, almost boyish. "She's leaking bad." Brown's eyes flicked across the panel. Oil temperature needles jumped, pressure dropped, lights blinked. Below them, Bremen's industrial district was glowing in black bursts, flak shells blossoming like dirty flowers through their formation. The bomb run had been messy. The aiming point had disappeared and reappeared in smoke. It did not matter. They had committed, run straight and level through the worst of the fire, loosed their load, and now the fortress was supposed to do what the crews had been told again and again it would do: bring them home. The second flak burst tore that belief open. This one hit aft. It came in as a hollow bang somewhere behind the radio room, then a harsh metallic shriek as shrapnel ripped sideways. The entire airplane flinched. The waist gunner saw a panel of skin the size of a door peel back, daylight slamming into the fuselage in a spray of fibers and insulation. A man's shout cut off mid-syllable. In the tail, something heavy fell, then stopped moving. Ye Olde Pub sagged in the air. The formation lifted away from her, the neat boxes of other B-17s rolling on, still tight, still holding their assigned altitudes and headings. Brown pulled at the yoke, feeling the wounded airplane resist, then slowly respond. They were dropping. The sky that had been full of friendly bombers became suddenly, terrifyingly empty. "Stay with them," the co-pilot Pinky Luke said through clenched teeth, more habit than hope. "I'm trying," Brown answered. The engines were not listening. Number 2 was coughing. Number 4 was running hot. Somewhere behind the cockpit, someone called for a medic and got only cold air in reply. They fell out of formation anyway. In seconds, they were below the others, under the protection of the interlocking guns, alone in the vertical space that every crewman knew was death's hunting ground. The roar of the engines changed pitch as the airplane fought for altitude. The wind noise grew louder as gaps in the skin became ragged mouths. Then the fighters came. They did not appear first as airplanes, only as thin, sharp lines crossing the sky, tracer arcs, converging streaks of light from head-on and from the sides. The men inside the B-17 swung their guns, fired into shapes that flashed past too quickly to count. A voice at the nose screamed that there were Messerschmitts everywhere. Another voice, in the top turret, shouted something about Focke-Wulfs. Over it all, the engines beat a grim, deep rhythm, one cylinder after another doing its job, no matter what was happening in the cabin. Brown saw a German fighter flash across their nose, black cross and yellow spinner visible for an instant. The windscreen was already starred with cracks, and oil was seeping across the lower glass in a moving stain. He tried to track the fighter, and could not. The fortress was heavy now, sluggish, flying as if through syrup. Somewhere aft there was a sudden, short burst of .50 caliber fire, a hoarse laugh cut off, then nothing. The tail gun had gone silent. The next minutes were a sequence of impacts and absences, A burst of fire took out the nose gun. Another chewed through the horizontal stabilizer. One of the waist guns jammed, the man swearing into the interphone as he yanked the charging handles. Heated air blew out through holes in the ducting. Frost crawled back over metal that had been briefly warm. A shell fragment came through the cockpit roof and grazed Brown's shoulder, leaving a line of fire under his jacket and a spreading patch of warmth that he could not afford to think about. When the fighters finally broke off, the silence was not true silence. It was the steady thunder of 3.5 working engines, the thin whine of air past twisted aluminum, the ragged breathing of 9 men who should not still have been alive. Brown risked a glance behind. Through what had once been solid skin, he could see the sky. The rear fuselage was shredded, its shape more suggestion than structure. The tailplane looked bent, like a toy left in the sun too long. Somewhere back there, the space where the tail gunner should have been was oddly still. They were alone. The formation was gone. The sky above was empty of friendly shapes. Below, the ground was a patchwork of winter fields and rail lines and factory roofs, receding by inches on the altimeter's slow climb, as Brown pulled to coax every bit of lift out of the damaged wings. "Course for home," he said, voice low. "Home," Luke repeated, as if it were an experiment. Between Bremen and the North Sea lay miles of enemy territory. Between Olde Pub and England lay the weight of gravity, the weakness of torn metal, and the cold mathematics of fuel and distance. The bomber should not have been flying. Yet the needles on the gauges still moved. The propellers still turned. The airplane, against sense, was still in the air. On the other side of that winter sky, a German fighter pilot rolled his Messerschmitt onto a new heading, scanning the broken layers of cloud and contrails for the next target of the day. For years, the men on both sides of this fight had been assured that the war in the air obeyed clear rules. There were numbers, ratios, performance charts. There were briefings, plastered with silhouettes and tables. There were training films and lectures, and slogans about duty. Underneath all of it, there was a set of beliefs that felt as solid as the steel under their boots. For the Luftwaffe, those beliefs had been forged earlier, in years of success. In 1940, against Poland, the Low Countries, France, they had seen their aircraft sweep the sky. The fighter arm had been young, aggressive, a community of men who understood themselves as the sharpened edge of a new kind of war. They flew in tight formations. They talked about tactics at night over cigarettes and coffee. They measured each other by kill tallies chalked on fuselages. By 1943, much of that early certainty had hardened. The Reich's leaders spoke constantly about total war. Propaganda framed the conflict as a struggle for survival against enemies who would show no mercy. In mess halls and briefing rooms, the message filtered down. Every bomber that got through meant German civilians killed. Every enemy crew brought down over German soil was one more small act of protection for families on the ground. In squadrons like the one that Franz Stigler flew with, there was also another layer, a professional code. Older officers talked about the traditions of the fighter pilot, about the First World War aces, about chivalry in the air. Those stories sat awkwardly beside the reality of 1943, with its mass raids and radar plots and command orders. Still, they were told. Men like Stigler heard them as young cadets, as they climbed into trainers and then into frontline machines that lifted from airfields across occupied Europe. They believed in the machine, too. The Bf-109 had its quirks and its weaknesses, but the pilots knew intimately what it could do. They could recite climb rates, turning circles, roll rates. They knew the feel of the stick in a stall, the exact pressure needed to kick a rudder and swing the nose. They trusted the guns in the wings and the cowl to spit their measured streams of 5.9 mm and 20 meters into the space they calculated a bomber would be in by the time the rounds arrived. There was an opposing belief about the enemy. The Americans had come late to the war in the air over Europe. When their first formations of four-engined bombers appeared, there had been a period of curiosity and cautious respect. The B-17s, with their bristling guns and box formations, looked formidable. But the Luftwaffe's training and experience told its men that any machine could be understood, countered, broken. Tactics were discussed, attack profiles tried. Men compared notes on where the bombers' defenses were weakest, on how close one could get on a head-on run before breaking away. The reports flowed up and down the chain. This was a war of paper as well as metal. Claim forms, damage assessments, intelligence digests. Charts were drawn that expressed in neat columns what it cost to bring down a bomber, how many fighters, how many sorties, how many lives. Those numbers, too, hardened into belief. If they fought hard enough and long enough, if they endured the loss rates their commanders demanded, they could blunt the American offensive, perhaps even force a change in strategy. On the American side, the beliefs had their own structure. The crews of the 8th Air Force had been told that the Flying Fortress was named that way for a reason. Film strips and manuals talked about its rugged construction, its self-sealing tanks, its ability to absorb punishment. In training stateside, instructors repeated the line, "This airplane will bring you home." Men saw photographs of B-17s with holes big enough to crawl through, still sitting on dispersal at English bases after missions, and those images settled into their minds as reassurance. They were told, too, that precision bombing could win the war, that if they hit the right factories, the right yards, the right nodes in Germany's industrial web, they could shorten the fighting, spare lives on the ground, perhaps avoid the need for another bloodbath like the First World War in the trenches. It was a technical argument, thick with diagrams and briefings, but underneath it lay a moral comfort. They were conducting war in a more controlled, more rational way than the enemy. All of this, the German confidence in fighter doctrine, the American trust in bomber ruggedness and strategic theory, was being tested in the sky between Bremen and the North Sea that day. Olde Pub was the kind of machine the training films did not show. Its skin was torn, its structure bent. The neat, clean lines of the factory drawings had been replaced by ragged edges and makeshift bandages of tape and cloth. Inside, the tidy systems that diagrams broke into boxes were leaking and shorting and failing one after another. But the beliefs persisted. Brown still gripped his controls, with the assumption that if he did his job, the airplane would do its job, and their combined effort could carry 9 wounded men back across enemy territory. In a ready room some miles behind them, German pilots sat waiting for the next scramble order, convinced that their cumulative skill and sacrifice would hold the line. Among those pilots, men followed unspoken rules about courage and fear. One did not talk too much about the odds. One did not dwell on the growing size of the American formations or the changing character of the war. There was always another sortie, another mission, another red line on the operations board. You climbed into the cockpit when told you used what you had been given in training and experience, and you trusted that the structure above you, command, strategy, Reich, knew what it was doing. Franz Stigler carried these layers of belief with him every time he strapped into a Bf-1009. He had learned to fly in peacetime, hunted bombers over the desert against the British, then returned home to find the war over Germany was different, heavier, more relentless. He had seen friends shot down. He had watched the changing composition of the squadron as older hands were lost, and their places filled by younger, less prepared men. By late 1943, he had also heard enough from Berlin to understand that the war was not going as the leadership claimed. Casualties mounted. The enemy's production seemed to increase rather than shrink under the bombing. Yet each time he was scrambled, the expectation was the same. Find the bombers, close with them, kill them. That was the role of the Jagdflieger. That was how a man protected his homeland, his family, his own sense of worth in a collapsing world. The rules were clear enough on paper. Engage the enemy. Prevent the bombers from reaching their targets or returning to bases from which they could strike again. No quarter was asked or offered. In a war defined ever more by statistics and tonnage, by the number of aircraft turned out each month and the amount of fuel burned in each raid, mercy was not part of the official doctrine. So when Stigler climbed into his fighter on that gray morning and took off into the cold air to intercept another American formation, he did so under the weight of duty and habit and belief. He checked his guns, watched his instruments, scanned the sky. He had already found and brought down bombers that day. He knew what it took to put one of the big machines into the ground. What he did not yet know, as he climbed into the path of the damaged American straggler, was that somewhere underneath all of those accumulated rules sat one last stubborn piece of an older code, a private line he would not cross, even when everything around him said he should. The first hint that something was wrong with the day's familiar pattern came not from a briefing board or a radar plot, but from the way a single aircraft looked against the winter sky. Stigler saw the B-17 as a dark shape at first, low, alone, heading northwest. It was not in formation, not under escort, not moving with the confidence of a healthy machine. He pushed the nose of his 109 down to intercept, feeling the modest gain in speed as gravity helped the Daimler-Benz engine. The controls in his hand were an extension of muscles long trained. His mind walked through attack options almost automatically. From the rear, slightly above, where the tail gunner's field of fire was limited. From below and ahead, where the big bomber was blind. As he closed the distance, the details sharpened. The B-17's tail looked twisted. The left horizontal stabilizer was chewed up. Panels of skin hung loose from the fuselage, fluttering in the slipstream. The top turret did not move to track him. No tracer reached out to greet his approach. He eased in behind and below. Outside the arcs he knew by heart. This close, he could see the bullet holes stitched along the airplane's side, the jagged edges where flak had blown out chunks the size of a man's torso. In one of the holes, unbelievably, he saw movement. A figure bent over another, hands working clumsily with bandages in the freezing air. Where the tail gun should have been, there was only the hunched shape of the shattered position, and, inside it, the still form of a man. No guns tracked him. No threat presented itself. The logical next step was clear. This was a damaged bomber, staggering home alone. It was, by the measure of any fighter pilot's day, an easy kill. Stigler's thumb hovered, then settled on the firing button. Through the canopy, he could hear, more than see, the vibration of the bomber's engines, each one beating against the damage it had taken. He had killed bombers before. Reduced to their essentials, they were structures of aluminum and rivets, gasoline and oxygen. A burst of cannon fire into the right place, and the machine would fail. The wing might tear off, the fuel might ignite, the bomber would drop. In training, his instructors had talked about attacking without hesitation. In combat, time spent thinking could be time lost to another enemy, or to the bomber's gunners, or to the flak. He knew all of that, had lived it. And yet, as he studied the B-17 through his gun sight, something else pushed forward in his mind. He remembered his commander's voice from years earlier, not in a classroom, but on a quiet evening, when the older man had let the official code slip enough to show the backbone under it. "Do not shoot a man in a parachute," he had said. "If I ever see you doing that, I will shoot you myself." There were lines that separated a fighter pilot from a murderer. They were thin sometimes, and they were easy to blur in the heat of battle. But they mattered. Looking at the B-17 now, at the wounded men inside, at the dead tail gunner, at the way the airplane struggled, Stigler felt that same line under his hands. Firing on this machine would be like firing on a man already hanging helpless in the air. He moved closer instead of shooting, so close that he could see faces through the torn skin and cracked plexiglass. An American gunner stared back at him, pale under the grime and blood, eyes wide in confusion. Brown, in the cockpit, saw the German fighter slid up along his right wing and thought for a moment that delirium had finally overtaken him. Inside the B-17, there was a flurry of movement as men reached for guns that no longer worked or were no longer there. The instinct was as deeply trained as Stigler's own. Enemy fighter equals threat. Shoot or be shot. Only the exhaustion and the reality of their weapons' condition kept them from trying to fight. Stigler raised one hand from the throttle, briefly, and made a small, sharp gesture, a downward motion, palm flat, toward the ground. It was an absurd moment. A German ace using hand signals in the freezing slipstream to talk to a battered American pilot, whose language he did not share beyond a few universal gestures. He pointed again, more insistently, toward a field that might serve as an emergency landing strip, then toward a bearing that would lead to Sweden, neutral, and perhaps safety. In the cockpit of Olde Pub, Brown saw the motions, but could not parse them fully. His world had narrowed to engine gauges, the trembling of the control column, the knowledge of miles yet to cross. He was not going to turn toward Germany. He was not going to risk an internment in a neutral country that might or might not take them. Home was west. He held his course. There was a long, thin pause in which two airplanes flew side by side through enemy airspace, their pilots separated by metal and language and uniform, but joined, briefly, in the same sheet of air. Under them, German flak batteries tracked the shapes, saw the familiar outline of a Messerschmitt escorting what appeared to be a crippled bomber. Crews hesitated, fingers resting on firing keys. If a fighter was so close to the American, it might be trying to force it down. Perhaps it was a captured machine. Perhaps it was some other trick. No one wanted to be the one who shot down a comrade. The gun stayed silent. Stigler understood that too. His presence beside the B-17 was a shield, as much as it was a violation of everything the day's orders had represented. He flew closer, wingtips separated by only a few yards of turbulent air. He could see, in that closeness, the detail that photographs never quite captured. The rippling flecks of skin over spars, the frost on rivet heads, the faint wobble in the bomber's tail as it fought to hold trim. After some minutes that felt longer than many dogfights, they reached the edge of the coast. The land gave way to the dull, metallic sheen of the North Sea. The line between enemy country and open water was not marked on the waves, but every pilot in that theater knew where it lay by instinct and practice. Here, Stigler made his choice manifest. He slid his aircraft forward, past the B-17's nose, then rolled gently away to the right, into a position where Brown and his co-pilot could see the whole length of his machine. He turned his head, met their gaze, and gave a small, unmistakable salute. Then he banked away, back toward Germany. Brown watched the Bf-1099 go, a dark, cross-marked shape dwindling against the gray. In the interphone, someone swore softly, not at the enemy, but at the sheer strangeness of the moment. The fighter had not fired. It had watched. It had, incomprehensibly, guarded them. There was no time to dwell on it. The engines were still straining. The wounded still needed attention. The distance to England was still an unbending fact. They nursed Olde Pub across the water, engine settings balanced not for textbook efficiency, but for what the damaged systems could bear. Every vibration felt like a precursor to failure. Every minute was a small negotiation with mechanical limits. But the airplane, abused and battered as it was, held together. When they finally crossed the English coast and lined up for an emergency landing at their diverted base, The men on the ground looked up and saw a machine that should not, by any reasonable account, have been flying. Panels flapped. Pieces hung. The tail looked one hard gust away from coming off. Yet the gear dropped, the airplane settled, and steel met runway in a shuddering, survivable landing roll. After the engines wound down and the propellers ticked to a stop, the silence on the ground was as heavy as the skies had been. Ground crew walked around the B-17, hands trailing over holes and buckled structures. Officers counted the paths that shrapnel and bullets had taken. Men shook their heads and sucked air through their teeth. The word miracle surfaced, not in a religious sense, but as a shorthand for something that seemed to stand one step beyond probability. In the debriefing room, under bright lights and the smell of coffee gone stale, Brown told the story. He described the flak, the fighters, the tail gunner killed at his post. Then he talked about the German who had appeared on their wing, close enough to see faces, who had gestured and then left without firing. The intelligence officer listened, took notes, and said very little. Later, a version of the report would move upward, thinned by the hands that passed it along. Somewhere along that chain, a decision would be made. This was not a story to spread widely. The men needed to believe in the hostility of the enemy. They needed to climb back into bombers knowing that any German fighter they saw was a lethal threat, not a potential guardian. The report would be filed. The mission would be added to the tally. The airplane would be patched or written off. The day would be folded into the larger statistics of the campaign. In Germany, Stigler landed, taxied in, and shut down his own machine. He did not write up a victory claim for the crippled bomber. He could have. No one would have known the difference. Instead, he walked away from his 109 with the quiet, contained expression of a man who had made a choice he could not explain to many around him. In the days that followed, the war did what wars do. It continued. Raids went out and came back, sometimes in force, sometimes in fragments. Pilots were killed. Others survived. Machines went out green and came back silvered with exhaust and patched aluminum. What had happened between Olde Pub and Franz Stigler stayed lodged in the memories of two men, each on his own side of the lines, each trying to reconcile that brief moment of recognition with the broader machinery of a conflict that seemed to allow no room for such things. Years later, as historians tallied up the strategic bombing campaign and analysts tried to express the turning of the air war in graphs and tables, the incident would surface as an anecdote. It was easy to treat it that way, a curious footnote, a human interest story pinned to the margins of narratives about tonnage dropped and refineries destroyed. But to understand why it mattered, it helps to step back and look at the arithmetic that had been grinding away underneath it from the start. By late 1943, the Anglo-American air forces were reaching a scale that the Luftwaffe had not been built to handle indefinitely. American factories were turning out B-17s and B-24s by the hundreds each month. Training commands in the United States were feeding streams of newly qualified crews into the pipeline. The British bomber force had already grown through its own period of costly trial and error, and was now routinely sending large formations against German targets at night. On the other side, German industry was under strain. The fighter arm had to defend ever larger sectors of airspace, from the Bay of Biscay to the Baltic. Fuel supplies were tightening. Replacement pilots were younger, less thoroughly trained, pushed into combat faster as older hands were lost. Aircraft production continued, and in some categories even increased, but the balance between quantity, quality, and the ability to supply those machines with fuel and spare parts was slowly tilting the wrong way. This imbalance expressed itself in simple ratios. To bring down a heavily armed, four-engined bomber, a certain number of fighter sorties had to be flown, a certain number of engagements made, a certain number of rounds expended. Each of those sorties carried a risk of being shot down by defensive guns, by escorting fighters, by flak. As the Americans and British refined their escort tactics and increased the number of protecting fighters, the cost to the Luftwaffe of attacking bomber formations rose sharply. The B-17's much advertised toughness, the quality that had helped Olde Pub survive, had a mathematical shadow. Each bomber that absorbed damage and still made it home reduced the effectiveness of the German defense by another fraction. Each crew that returned could be sent out again, adding to the cumulative weight of the campaign. Losses remained high for the Allies, particularly in certain periods, but the industrial and training base behind them was deep. Germany's was not. It could innovate and adapt. New fighter models, new tactics, new weapons like air-to-air rockets. But each adaptation cost time and resources. The enemy, meanwhile, was not standing still. Long-range fighters like the P-51 began to appear in greater numbers, pushing deeper into German airspace, escorting the bombers all the way to targets that had previously lain beyond effective fighter cover. In that sense, the defeat of the Luftwaffe in the defensive air war over Germany was not decided in any single duel or on any one mission. It emerged from curves on graphs, from production schedules, from attrition tables. The rollers in American factories had as much to do with it as the hands on throttles over Bremen. Against that backdrop, the decision of one German pilot to spare one American bomber did not alter the outcome of the campaign. The tons of bombs dropped, the fuel consumed, the cities ruined, the oil fields set alight. None of that turned on a single act of mercy. But mathematics does not capture everything that matters. The logic of defeat can tell you why a structure collapsed. It does not tell you what kept certain beams from breaking when all the calculations said they could, or why a man chose to step back from an action that fit perfectly within the numerical logic of his side. Decades after the engines had cooled and the runways had been repurposed or left to grass, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler met again. They were older men by then, their faces lined, their postures shaped by time. The uniforms were gone. The sky over their heads was peaceful. Each had spent years wondering about the other. Brown had told close friends and family about his German, the man in the 109 who had appeared on his wing and not fired. Stigler had carried the memory of the shredded B-17 and the faces looking back at him, a private counterweight to the harsher memories of the war. When they finally found each other and shook hands, the distance between their wartime roles shrank. They spoke, through interpreters and through the shared language of flyers, about that day over Germany. They filled in each other's gaps. They recognized, in the other's recollection, the same pivot point, the moment when the expected act had not happened. Their friendship that followed did not undo anything that had gone before. It did not erase the dead or rebuild the cities. It did not make the air war less brutal in retrospect. What it did was offer a small, solid example of something that can be hard to hold on to in accounts of industrialized conflict. That even deep inside systems designed to convert fuel and metal into destruction, individual judgment still exists. Men who read about this incident now, especially those who spent their own younger years around machines and tools and the disciplined routines of service, often respond to it with a quiet nod. They understand, perhaps instinctively, how much pressure there is to let systems make decisions for you. They also recognize the weight of choosing, in a single moment, to assert a different standard. The lasting lesson of the encounter between Olde Pub and Franz Stigler is not that war is secretly full of such gestures. Most of the time, it is not. It is that, amid all the charts and orders and ratios, there remains a space where a man can decide that honor consists not only in doing one's duty as defined by command, but in drawing a line he will not cross, even when no one is watching. If there is a final image to hold, It is not of tracers or burning engines, but of two aging pilots sitting side by side, looking up at a quiet sky. Somewhere above them, at an altitude no longer measured in feet and knots but in memory, a battered bomber and a single German fighter still fly for a few minutes. Wingtip to wingtip, across a border that neither bullets nor numbers can fully explain.